Imagine living in a place where danger lurks around every corner, where armed groups fight for power, and where peace feels like a distant dream. That's the reality in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, a country that has been drowning in conflict for years, just like the troubled Sahel region. Right now, over 100 armed groups are wreaking havoc across the country, turning entire communities into battlegrounds. And just last week, one of the most feared rebel groups, M23, stormed into Goma, one of the DRC's major cities, tightening its grip on the region. Things have only gotten worse, with the Congolese government pointing fingers at Rwanda, accusing it of secretly supporting the rebels. But as tensions rise, there's one major player that seems to be doing little to stop the chaos: the African Union. For years, the AU has watched as conflict after conflict tears African nations apart, yet its response has been lukewarm at best. And now, one leader has had enough. President Ibrahim Traore is calling them out, slamming the AU for failing to step in and bring stability to the DRC. But what exactly did he say? And why is his message so important? Let's break it down. Before continuing, we would love to ask you a question about Ibrahim Traore. Is he the ideal president every African country should have? Let us know what you think in the comment section below. For years, Africa has been plagued by conflict, instability, and terrorism. Yet the one organization that was supposed to unite and protect the continent, the African Union, has done little more than talk. And now, President Ibrahim Traore is making it clear. He's had enough. In a recent interview, Traore didn't hold back his frustration. He spoke about the ongoing bloodshed in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where innocent children have been caught in the crossfire for years. But the DRC isn't alone. Sudan is also drowning in violence, and yet the African Union remains on the sidelines. We would have expected the AU to be strong enough to help its own people find peace, he said. But instead, it does nothing. He didn't stop there. He pointed to the Sahel, where terrorism has gripped the region for nearly a decade. Countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have been under constant attack, yet there's been no real effort from the AU to put an end to the crisis. And the problem goes beyond just these regions. Across Africa, from Libya to the Central African Republic, from Sudan to the DRC, conflict has become the norm. Some nations have never truly known peace since gaining independence. Even relatively stable countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and Togo still battle terrorism and insecurity. So where is the African Union in all of this? What has it actually done? Leaders hold meetings, make speeches, and issue statements, but when it comes to real action, nothing. That's why so many African nations have had no choice but to turn to outside powers for help. Western military forces, from the US to France, Germany, and even Russia, have stepped in. But has that solved the problem? Not at all. The violence continues, the conflicts drag on, and the cycle of instability never ends. For years, powerful foreign militaries with advanced weapons and cutting-edge intelligence have stationed themselves across Africa, supposedly to fight terrorism and instability. Yet, instead of peace, the violence has only grown worse. How does that even make sense? Armed groups and rebel forces, often using outdated weapons, continue to thrive despite the overwhelming presence of these foreign armies. If these forces were truly here to help, shouldn't the conflicts have been resolved by now? Instead, the battles rage on, and the ones who suffer most are the innocent civilians caught in the middle. It's frustrating, it's heartbreaking, and most of all, it's telling. Clearly, these foreign powers are not here to solve Africa's security crisis. Their presence hasn't eliminated the threats, it has only prolonged the chaos. So if Africans want real change, they'll have to take matters into their own hands. But there's a problem. The one organisation that should be leading the charge, the African Union, has done little to prove that it can handle this crisis. And this is exactly why President Ibrahim Traore is speaking out. He's calling out the African Union, not just for failing to act on security issues, but for its silence in the face of blatant injustices committed against African nations. Just recently, A foreign government publicly admitted to backing a brutal terrorist attack against forces in Traore's confederation. And how did the African Union respond? With silence. No condemnation, no action, nothing. And this isn't the first time. Not long ago, Ukraine openly admitted to supporting Tuareg rebels in an attack on Mali. Once again, the African Union did nothing. No statements, no pushback, no defense of a fellow African nation. The African Union's silence speaks volumes. It's not just that they haven't condemned the attack, it's that they probably never will. And why would they? After all, the AU isn't even financially independent. Reports show that more than 75% of its funding comes from outside Africa, mostly from the European Union and major European countries like France. Now think about that for a moment. If the AU depends on foreign money, how can it ever act freely in the best interests of Africa? See the problem? Now imagine if the situation were reversed. If a Western country had been attacked the way Mali was, do you think they'd stay silent? Not a chance. They'd retaliate. It might even spark a full-blown war. But when it happens to an African nation, nothing. Just quiet acceptance. Again and again, the African Union has watched as Western nations interfere in Africa's affairs, overthrowing governments, backing rebel groups and fueling instability. And every time, the AU does nothing. That's why President Ibrahim Traore is raising his voice. He's calling on the AU to stop being a passive observer and actually stand up for the continent. I want them to hear this cry and break their silence, he said. They need to take action so that young people can believe in the African Union again. But the real question is, will they? Before answering that, let's take a look at the unfolding crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Sudan, two nations that have been trapped in endless cycles of violence. Let's start with the DRC. On Monday, January 27, 2025, one of the most feared rebel groups, M23, launched a bold attack on Goma airport. They had already taken control of Goma, the largest city in North Kivu province, and now they wanted full dominance. If they seized the airport, the city would be entirely in their hands. But the Congolese army wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. Gunfire erupted. Explosions shook the ground. The battle turned the city into a war zone. In the chaos, at least 17 UN peacekeepers lost their lives, and over 300 others were injured. The violence has only made an already dire refugee crisis even worse. Terrified civilians are fleeing, desperate to find safety. Ironically, many of them had come to Goma thinking it was a place of refuge. Now, they're on the run again. And it's not just civilians escaping. Some Congolese soldiers, unable to hold their ground, have crossed the border into Rwanda, seeking safety for themselves. Rwandan forces reported that around 120 Congolese soldiers had laid down their weapons and surrendered, signaling just how intense the situation in the region has become. Meanwhile, Victor Songo, a spokesperson for the Congolese Rebel Alliance, stated that Goma had been struggling ever since M23 fighters captured the nearby towns of Minova and Sake. Although the Congolese government has not officially confirmed M23's takeover of Goma, they have acknowledged that rebel forces are present within the city. In response to escalating tensions, Congo made a bold move on Sunday, cutting diplomatic ties with Rwanda. Officials in Kinshasa have long accused Kigali of providing weapons and manpower to M23, claims that Rwanda has repeatedly denied. Even as these accusations fly back and forth, the United Nations has stepped in, calling for all foreign troops to withdraw, though Rwanda insists it must remain prepared to defend itself. But this attack is just the latest in a long and bloody history. M23 has been a source of terror in the region since 2012, leaving destruction in its wake. Similar to the Tuareg rebels in Mali, they claim to be fighting for the rights of the Tutsi minority. However, their so-called cause has resulted in mass casualties and the displacement of countless civilians. But the Democratic Republic of Congo isn't the only country in crisis. Sudan, too, is caught in a storm of instability, much of it stemming from a turbulent past of political violence. After the overthrow of longtime ruler Omar al-Bashir in 2019, the country's attempt at democracy quickly spiraled into chaos. Instead of uniting Sudan, the transitional government, made up of both military and civilian leaders, became a battleground of its own. At the heart of the power struggle are two key figures: General Abdel Fattah Burhan, the leader of Sudan's official military, and General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, the head of the powerful paramilitary force known as the Rapid Support Forces. These two men, both hungry for control, have turned Sudan into a war zone. By July 2023, Sudan was already drowning in crisis, facing political turmoil, economic collapse, and social unrest. Skyrocketing inflation, severe shortages of food and fuel, and an increasingly frustrated population have led to mass protests. And if that wasn't enough, long-standing conflicts in Darfur and South Kordofan continue to rage on, fueled by ethnic divisions and the fight over natural resources. The worsening effects of climate change, frequent floods and devastating droughts have only added to the suffering, pushing the country's already fragile systems to the brink of collapse. Despite the presence of foreign troops, including those from the United States, the conflicts in both the Democratic Republic of Congo and Sudan have only worsened. Some experts argue that rather than bringing stability, these outside military forces have complicated the situation, often pursuing their own interests instead of genuinely working to resolve the violence. But here's the real question. Where is the African Union in all of this? The AU, an organization that was created to promote peace, unity, and stability across the continent, has been noticeably absent. Its failure to take decisive action has raised serious concerns about its credibility and effectiveness. The African Union was officially launched in 2002, taking over from the Organization of African Unity, OAU, which had been in existence since 1963. Its mission was ambitious: to bring African nations together, strengthen diplomatic ties, and, most importantly, ensure peace and security across the continent. At its core, the AU was built on the idea that Africa should take charge of its own problems. The Peace and Security Council, one of its key arms, was supposed to be the engine of conflict resolution, capable of handling disputes through mediation, sanctions, and, when necessary, the deployment of peacekeeping forces. And in the past, the AU has stepped up. During the civil wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone, AU-backed peacekeeping missions played a critical role in restoring stability. In 2017, when Gambia was on the brink of a violent political crisis, the AU worked alongside regional leaders to push then-President Yahya Jammeh to step down peacefully after he lost the election. That intervention likely prevented a full-scale civil war. These cases prove that the AU can act when it chooses to. But there's another side to this story, a long list of failures. In 2013, African leaders set a bold goal: silence the guns by 2020. The idea was to put an end to the continent's armed conflicts, ensuring that future generations wouldn't have to inherit these problems. But by the time 2020 arrived, Africa was far from peaceful. In fact, from 1990 to 2020, over 650 armed conflicts had taken place across the continent, showing just how little progress had been made. Then, in 2016, the AU launched the Lusaka Roadmap, a strategy that laid out 54 key steps to finally end these conflicts. The plan was ambitious. It focused on strengthening Africa's peacekeeping forces, preventing the flow of weapons to rebel groups, tackling corruption, and even addressing human trafficking. On paper, it looked like a solid strategy, but in reality, little has changed. At the heart of the African Union's mission is the promise of peace, an ambitious goal that, on paper, sounds like the perfect solution for a continent riddled with conflict. The AU's Peace and Security Council was designed to address Africa's crises using African-led solutions, relying on diplomacy, sanctions, and peacekeeping missions to resolve disputes. But despite these noble intentions, reality tells a different story. From the moment African leaders declared their commitment to solving their own problems, they faced overwhelming challenges. The idea of eliminating armed conflict by 2020 was always an ambitious target, especially considering the sheer number of wars, insurgencies, and political upheavals across the continent. One major issue is that many of these conflicts are internal, rooted in tensions between governments and their own people. When grievances go unheard for years, protests escalate, turning into full-scale rebellions. Take Cameroon's Anglophone crisis. What began as peaceful calls for recognition quickly spiraled into violent conflict, largely ignored by both the Cameroonian government and the AU. Then there are the conflicts that the AU simply failed to contain. When Côte d'Ivoire was plunged into crisis, the African Union could have stepped up with a firm, unified response. Instead, it hesitated. The same happened in Libya, an African nation that was left to be overrun by foreign intervention when NATO stepped in under the pretext of bringing stability. Instead, Libya was torn apart, its government collapsed, and the country descended into chaos, a crisis that still hasn't been resolved to this day. If the African Union had acted decisively, perhaps Africa wouldn't have had to depend on outsiders to solve its problems. Instead, time and time again, the AU has shown that it lacks the ability or the will to enforce its own mandates. Yet, despite these failures, one thing is clear. The AU has shown glimpses of what it is capable of when it actually takes action. The question is, why doesn't it do so more often? This is exactly why President Ibrahim Traore is pushing for an alternative. He believes the AU is beyond saving. If the organisation refuses to defend Africa's sovereignty and act decisively, then maybe it's time to dismantle it altogether. Instead, African nations should rally behind the Alliance of Sahel States, AES. Formed in May 2024 by Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso, the AES is built on the idea that African nations should be self-reliant, both in security and economic matters. The 3 member states have already taken bold steps, cutting ties with France, expelling foreign troops, and shifting their focus towards strengthening national defence. Unlike the AU, the AES doesn't rely on Western funding, meaning it can make independent decisions without external pressure. This independence has allowed its members to prioritise their own economies, nationalising resources that were once controlled by foreign corporations. Mali, for instance, has renegotiated its gold mining contracts to ensure the country gets a larger share of the profits. Burkina Faso has halted gold exports altogether, choosing instead to refine its own resources domestically. And Niger? It kicked out Orano, the French uranium giant, taking full control of one of its most valuable natural assets. These moves aren't just about money, they're about sovereignty, true uncompromising independence from Western influence. Now, imagine if more African nations joined the AES. With financial independence and a strong security alliance, Africa could finally break free from the cycle of foreign intervention. Unlike ECOWAS or the AU, the AES is proving that African nations can stand on their own without relying on Europe or the West to dictate their future. So here's the big question. Will Africa's leaders answer Traore's call and rally behind the AES? Or will they continue to place their trust in the AU despite its repeated failures? If you found this video interesting and would love to watch more videos like this, be sure to hit that like button, so next time YouTube will push videos like this to you.